Imagine you're halfway across the Atlantic, 39,000 feet above the ocean, when suddenly both engines fail. The aircraft starts descending into darkness. Oxygen masks drop, and the cabin fills with fear. This was the terrifying reality for the 306 people aboard Air Transat Flight 236. What happened next defied all odds and turned into one of the most miraculous stories of survival in aviation history. But how did this catastrophe unfold? And what decisions led to a glider-like descent over the vast ocean? Join us as we unravel the harrowing mystery of Flight 236. On a seemingly routine day, Air Transat Flight 236 prepared for its long journey across the Atlantic. The massive Airbus A330 sat at Toronto Pearson International Airport, shimmering under the runway lights as 293 passengers and 13 crew members boarded. It was August 24th, 2001, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The aircraft was pushed back from the gate, the engines roared to life, and the journey to Lisbon, Portugal began. But little did anyone know, this was the calm before the storm. Somewhere deep inside that aircraft, an unseen danger was already lurking, one that would soon turn this flight into a life-or-death struggle at 39,000 feet. What could possibly go wrong on a flight that had taken off so smoothly? Imagine soaring across the vast, endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a 7-hour journey connecting the modern skyscrapers of Toronto, Canada, to the historic streets of Lisbon, Portugal. Air Transat Flight 236 had flown this route many times before, a well-trodden path across the western Atlantic into Europe. For the passengers, it was just another transatlantic flight. But this time, something was different. Somewhere along that vast stretch of ocean, far from any land, a catastrophe was brewing. The passengers remained blissfully unaware, gazing out at the blue horizon as the clock silently ticked toward disaster. The plane chosen for this journey was a giant of the skies, a 1,999-built Airbus A330, a state-of-the-art aircraft equipped with 362 seats. With over 10,000 hours of flight time under its wings, this was no ordinary machine. It was an engineering marvel designed to withstand the rigors of long-haul flights. Loaded with over 46.9 tons of fuel, well beyond the legal minimum, everything seemed in place for a safe and smooth journey. But lurking beneath the surface, hidden deep within the plane's complex systems, was a problem that no one had yet noticed, one that would soon put every single person on board in unimaginable peril. At the controls of Flight 236 were two highly skilled aviators. Captain Robert Pitch, a seasoned 48-year-old pilot with a remarkable 17,700 flight hours, including nearly 800 hours on the Airbus. A330 led the charge. He was a man who had seen it all in his decades of flying. His first officer, Dirk de Jager, was younger but equally capable, with 4,800 flight hours under his belt. Together, they were a formidable team, ready to tackle anything the skies could throw at them. Or so they thought. In just a few short hours, these two men would be thrust into a nightmare scenario, one that would test every ounce of their skill, judgment, and courage. Metal chips in the aircraft's oil filter were found during standard maintenance, suggesting possible engine problems. The repair crew chose to replace the engine after they were unable to identify the source of these chips. The engine that was removed was in a post-service configuration, while the new engine that was lent by Rolls-Royce was in a pre-service bulletin configuration. Due to a collision with the fuel pump inlet tube, the rear hydraulic pump from the removed engine could not be installed on the new engine as a result of this difference. The lead technician relied on the advice of the maintenance engineering department, which recommended using only the rear fuel tube from the old engine, since he did not have access to service bulletins on the accessible computer terminals. The technicians made sure there was enough room between the fuel tube and the hydraulic tube by according to this advice. The technicians checked their work after installing the new engine and discovered no problems. The engine also passed a ground run test. Shortly before 1 in the morning, the aircraft was then given the all clear to take off. As the Airbus A330-243 of Air Transat Flight 236 roared down the runway in Toronto. On that fateful night, the passengers felt a familiar sense of anticipation. The engines hummed with power as the aircraft descended gracefully into the night sky, climbing eastward into the unknown. Once the plane reached a cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, it settled into a peaceful rhythm. The night was calm, the skies clear. The passengers, unaware of the brewing danger, dozed off or lost themselves in books and movies. For the crew, it was just another flight over the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, one that they had performed countless times. Little did they know that they were heading straight into the heart of an unfolding nightmare, one that would test their limits in ways they could never have imagined. Several hours into the flight, cruising smoothly over the endless stretch of the Atlantic, the cockpit's calm was suddenly shattered. Captain Piche glanced at the secondary display showing the engine readings. What he saw instantly set off alarms in his mind. There were anomalies, disturbing ones. The right-hand engine was showing unusual oil pressure, and the temperature and oil quantity were fluctuating in ways that didn't make sense. Pilots like Peach had learned to trust their instincts over the years, and his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Yet, he couldn't pinpoint what. This wasn't a situation he had ever encountered before. The crew quickly turned to the aircraft's manuals, searching for answers, but to their growing frustration, the explanations they needed weren't there. The oil temperature was dropping, something that wasn't supposed to happen. Pilots were trained to expect engine oil temperatures to rise as the engines worked harder, especially on a long transatlantic flight. But this was different. Picha and his co-pilot, Dirk de Jager, exchanged worried glances. What were they dealing with? They contacted the maintenance control center on the ground, hoping for guidance. But even the experts there couldn't decipher the troubling data. It was as if the aircraft was speaking a language no one could understand. What none of them knew was that this confusing stream of readings was the first sign of a catastrophe that was slowly unfolding. A catastrophe that would soon escalate and put every soul on board in unimaginable danger. As Air Transat Flight 236 continued its journey over the Atlantic, unknown to the passengers and crew, a hidden danger was unfolding deep within the right-hand engine. What seemed like a perfectly operational engine was, in reality, masking a catastrophic problem. During an earlier engine replacement, an almost invisible yet devastating mistake had been made. The fuel and hydraulic lines, two vital arteries of the aircraft, were positioned too close to each other. Though it appeared to the engineers that there was sufficient clearance, they had not considered the powerful forces of hydraulic pressure that the aircraft would endure during flight. As time passed, these lines, meant to be separate, began to wear against one another with every vibration and movement of the plane. The friction was relentless, and eventually it led to the unthinkable. The fuel line ruptured. A significant hole had formed, allowing precious fuel to pour out into the skies. The loss was staggering. Instead of consuming the usual 2.6 tons of fuel per hour, the aircraft was hemorrhaging between 12 to 15 tons per hour, an unimaginable rate. Yet, astonishingly, the right engine continued to function as though nothing was wrong. The plane's fuel system, designed with multiple redundancies, kept feeding the engine, unaware that a disaster was looming. Every minute that passed was one closer to a potential catastrophe. Airbus aircraft, like Flight 236, are designed with intricate fuel systems meant to maintain balance and efficiency throughout a flight. The Airbus A330 carried several fuel tanks, one in each wing, a trim tank in the tail's horizontal stabilizer, and a central tank. These tanks work in harmony to ensure the plane remains balanced during flight. The trim tank's purpose is to transfer fuel from the rear to the forward wing tanks, usually about 35 minutes before landing, or when the aircraft descends below 24,500 feet. This system ensures an even distribution of weight and fuel when the plane touches down. Underscore, but that night, something went terribly wrong. The trim tank began transferring fuel to the wing tanks much earlier than it should have. This premature transfer, unnoticed by the pilots, sent all of the remaining fuel from the tail forward, adding to the fuel being consumed at an alarming rate. The cockpit warned the crew of the anomaly, but in the chaos and confusion of the moment, the message was missed. They were now racing against time, unaware that their fuel reserves were dwindling far faster than anticipated. As Air Transat Flight 236 cruised over the Atlantic, the pilots were already grappling with unusual oil readings. Suddenly, another ominous message flashed on the ECAM display: a fuel imbalance warning. This wasn't just a minor issue. It indicated that one wing's tanks held significantly more fuel than the other. For an aircraft soaring through the skies, balance is crucial. An imbalance like this could jeopardize the entire flight. In moments like these, pilots rely on a mix of experience and procedural knowledge, the Airbus. A 330's ECAM doesn't provide specific instructions for handling a fuel imbalance. Instead, it directs pilots to consult the Quick Reference Handbook, QRH, for further guidance. But in the heat of the moment, with years of experience behind them, the captain made a critical decision: skip the handbook and act based on memory and intuition. The captain opened the crossfeed valve, intending to transfer fuel from one side to the other and correct the imbalance. To further balance the tanks, they shut off the fuel pumps for the right wing. The plan seemed straightforward, but there was a hidden danger lurking beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to the pilots, the right engine was already leaking fuel at an alarming rate, and their actions unintentionally worsened the situation. By opening the crossfeed valve, they allowed more fuel to be diverted into the leaking system. In less than 10 minutes, the pilots noticed the fuel levels dropping rapidly. What had started as an imbalance had turned into an escalating crisis. The gravity of the situation began to sink in as they realized they didn't have enough fuel left to make it to their destination. Lisbon, the closest major airport, was slipping out of reach. Every second counted as they raced against time to figure out what to do next. The terrifying realization hit them. This wasn't just a mechanical issue. It was a life or death situation, and the fuel they so desperately needed was draining away faster than they could imagine. With fuel levels dropping rapidly and the reality of their dire situation sinking in, the pilots of Air Transat Flight 236 faced an urgent decision. Where could they land in the middle of the vast Atlantic Ocean? There were few viable options in this remote region, but one stood out: Lajes Airport, located on the Portuguese island of Terceira. It was one of the only places within reach, but even then it was still hundreds of miles away. The clock was ticking, and every moment mattered. As the pilots debated their diversion plan, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. They were on the brink of a full-blown emergency, and the gravity of the situation couldn't be overstated. Suddenly, the door to the cockpit opened, and a member of the cabin crew entered. The crew member had been alerted to the situation and wanted to know what was happening. The pilots quickly explained the technical issues and the urgent need to divert to another airport. The crew member, trying to remain calm under pressure, asked what they could do to assist. The pilots instructed the crew member to perform a visual inspection of the wings. If there was a fuel leak, it needed to be confirmed. With the cabin lights dimmed to enhance visibility, the crew member grabbed a flashlight and peered out through the cabin windows. The darkness outside made the task even more challenging. Finding a fuel leak at night is no easy feat. During the day, a leak would have been relatively easy to spot, but in the pitch-black sky, it was nearly impossible. The crew member carefully scanned the wings, but despite their best efforts, they couldn't find anything unusual. There were no visible signs of a leak, no streams of fuel trailing behind the wings, but the fuel levels told a different story. Something was seriously wrong. The situation remained a mystery, and without concrete evidence of the leak, the crew had no choice but to trust their instruments and continue on their diversion course to Layas. As they pressed forward, uncertainty filled the air. The passengers were still unaware of the unfolding drama, blissfully ignorant of the fact that they were flying on borrowed time. The pilots, meanwhile, had no choice but to rely on their training, their instincts, and each other as they raced toward what they hoped would be a safe landing. As the pilots navigated through the situation, trying to make sense of the conflicting signals, a dangerous assumption took root. Both pilots believed that the amount of fuel on board was sufficient, and there were no additional warnings on the ECAM, the aircraft's central alert system. With no clear indication of an immediate issue, they began to speculate that perhaps the problem wasn't as serious as it seemed. Maybe it was just a computer glitch. Could it be a fuel leak? One of them asked, momentarily considering the possibility. That would mean descending to a lower altitude, the other pilot responded, dismissing the thought. They both weighed their options, and in the end, decided not to initiate the standard fuel leak procedure. After all, the plane's systems weren't showing any other signs of trouble. It felt safer to assume that this was a false alarm rather than a life-threatening emergency. This decision would later be scrutinized as a pivotal moment in the unfolding drama, a decision based on incomplete information and assumptions that would come back to haunt them. In the aftermath, investigators found that if the pilots had followed any of the recommended fuel leak procedures, they could have avoided the full-blown emergency that was to come. The engine fuel leak procedure, the wing fuel leak procedure, or even the generic fuel leak not located procedure, all of these would have ensured that the aircraft had enough fuel to reach its diversion airport with at least 3.8 metric tons of fuel left. Yet none of these procedures were followed. The captain's decision to disregard the fuel leak protocol was a critical error. It's one of those decisions that seems logical in the moment, but with the benefit of hindsight, becomes glaringly wrong. The pilots chose to stick with their initial assessment, believing in the glitch theory, and in doing so, missed their chance to resolve the issue before it became a catastrophe. The reason behind this oversight lies in a common psychological phenomenon known as framing bias. Framing bias occurs when someone becomes so focused on a specific perspective that they ignore or downplay information that contradicts it. It's a kind of tunnel vision, where your brain clings to the idea that fits your narrative and disregards anything that challenges it. In this case, the pilots were convinced that the fuel issue was a result of a computer glitch, and they began filtering everything through that lens. They dismissed or overlooked other critical clues that would have suggested a much more dangerous situation unfolding beneath the surface. This fixation on the computer glitch theory clouded their judgment, preventing them from recognizing the true nature of the problem until it was almost too late. As a result, the aircraft's systems and warnings, which should have been seen as a lifeline, became noise in the background, a distraction from the narrative the pilots had already decided upon. In a high-stakes environment like the cockpit of an airliner, that kind of cognitive bias can mean the difference between life and death. As the pilots navigated through the situation, trying to make sense of the conflicting signals, a dangerous assumption took root. Both pilots believed that the amount of fuel on board was sufficient, and there were no additional warnings on the ECAM, the aircraft's central alert system. With no clear indication of an immediate issue, they began to speculate that perhaps the problem wasn't as serious as it seemed. Maybe it was just a computer glitch. Could it be a fuel leak? One of them asked, momentarily considering the possibility. That would mean descending to a lower altitude, the other pilot responded, dismissing the thought. They both weighed their options, and in the end, decided not to initiate the standard fuel leak procedure. After all, the plane's systems weren't showing any other signs of trouble. It felt safer to assume that this was a false alarm rather than a life-threatening emergency. This decision would later be scrutinized as a pivotal moment in the unfolding drama, a decision based on incomplete information and assumptions that would come back to haunt them. In the aftermath, investigators found that if the pilots had followed any of the recommended fuel leak procedures, they could have avoided the full-blown emergency that was to come. The engine fuel leak procedure, the wing fuel leak procedure, or even the generic fuel leak not located procedure. All of these would have ensured that the aircraft had enough fuel to reach its diversion airport with at least 3.8 metric tons of fuel left. Yet, none of these procedures were followed. The captain's decision to disregard the fuel leak protocol was a critical error. It's one of those decisions that seems logical in the moment, but with the benefit of hindsight, becomes glaringly wrong. The pilots chose to stick with their initial assessment, believing in the glitch theory, and in doing so, missed their chance to resolve the issue before it became a catastrophe. The reason behind this oversight lies in a common psychological phenomenon known as framing bias. Framing bias occurs when someone becomes so focused on a specific perspective that they ignore or downplay information that contradicts it. It's a kind of tunnel vision, where your brain clings to the idea that fits your narrative and disregards anything that challenges it. In this case, the pilots were convinced that the fuel issue was a result of a computer glitch, and they began filtering everything through that lens. They dismissed or overlooked other critical clues that would have suggested a much more dangerous situation unfolding beneath the surface. This fixation on the computer glitch theory clouded their judgment, preventing them from recognizing the true nature of the problem until it was almost too late. As a result, the aircraft's systems and warnings, which should have been seen as a lifeline, became noise in the background, a distraction from the narrative the pilots had already decided upon. In a high-stakes environment like the cockpit of an airliner, that kind of cognitive bias can mean the difference between life and death. Amid the chaos of the unfolding emergency, the cockpit was a whirlwind of tasks. The pilots found themselves juggling multiple responsibilities, running through emergency checklists, coordinating with maintenance control on the ground, and organizing the diversion plan with air traffic control and the cabin crew. The cockpit was a scene of controlled chaos, with every moment demanding their full attention. Despite the gravity of the situation, there was no time for the pilots to step back, take a breath, and reconsider their assumptions. They were locked into a rhythm of constant problem solving, but the fuel imbalance refused to correct itself. In their attempts to address the issue, the pilots had already tried moving fuel between tanks, but the problem seemed more stubborn than anticipated. The situation required quick thinking, yet the pilots were trapped in a storm of tasks that made it difficult to see the bigger picture. Despite their efforts, the problem worsened. The aircraft's fuel continued to drain at an alarming rate, much faster than the crew could manage. The clock was ticking, and every drop of fuel lost brought them closer to disaster. Realizing the severity of the situation, the pilots made a crucial decision. They toggled the left and right wing fuel pumps on and off, attempting to balance the aircraft by creating a cross-feed of fuel from the right wing tanks to both engines. But the solution was only temporary, and the fuel kept disappearing at a terrifying speed. The anxiety in the cockpit was palpable. They needed to act fast, but the relentless pace of the crisis left little room for error. With fuel levels plummeting, the pilots knew they needed to act immediately. They set their sights on Lajes Airport, a military airfield on the island of Terceira, and reported their emergency to Santa Maria Air Traffic Control. They declared a fuel emergency, explaining that they were in urgent need of assistance. At this point, the aircraft carried only 7 tons of fuel, just 6% of its full capacity. It was a razor-thin margin that offered no room for mistakes. As they diverted toward Lajes, the captain maintained communication with the maintenance control center, desperately trying different fuel system settings in a last-ditch effort to resolve the crisis. But despite their best efforts, the fuel continued to vanish. The pilots were now in a race against time, pushing both the aircraft and their own capabilities to the limit. Every second mattered as they hurtled toward the airfield, praying that they had enough fuel to make it. The situation took a critical turn when the aircraft's right engine flamed out at an altitude of 39,000 feet, just 150 miles from the nearest airport. What had started as a manageable crisis now spiraled into a full-blown emergency. With the loss of the right engine, the pilot's margin of error drastically shrank. The captain instinctively increased thrust on the remaining engine, but flying on one engine at such a high altitude was no longer feasible. As the reality of their dire situation set in, the aircraft's fuel supply had dwindled to a mere 600 kilograms. The pilots knew that time was not on their side. Every second brought them closer to a forced landing. The first officer quickly contacted air traffic control, declaring a mayday. The urgency in his voice cut through the airwaves, signaling the gravity of the unfolding disaster. Air Transat 236 control, mayday, mayday, mayday. Those were the chilling words that reverberated through the cockpit as the first officer declared an emergency. Knowing they had limited time and resources, he also made an announcement to the passengers and crew, instructing them to prepare for an emergency landing. The possibility of a water landing loomed large, and the tension on board was palpable. The fate of everyone on board hung in the balance. Just 13 minutes after the right engine flamed out, the unthinkable happened. The fuel levels had dropped so dangerously low that the left engine failed as well. When the left engine flamed out, the cockpit was plunged into darkness. The aircraft lost its main source of electrical power, leaving the crew to navigate a pitch-black cockpit with only minimal instruments still operational. The situation became even more desperate as the aircraft began descending, causing the cabin pressure to drop and oxygen levels to decrease. Passengers and crew scrambled to don oxygen masks as the plane continued its uncontrolled descent. With both engines out of commission, the pilots were faced with the ultimate challenge. They had to land the aircraft without any engine power. In a situation like this, electrical power is a crucial lifeline. Fortunately, the Airbus A330 was equipped with a ram air turbine, RAT, a small wind-powered generator that deployed from underneath the aircraft. As the aircraft sliced through the air, the RAT generated just enough electricity to power the most critical instruments and systems, providing the pilots with a sliver of hope. But with no engine power and only the RAT to rely on, the margin for error was razor thin. The aircraft was now a glider, and the pilots had one shot at making a safe landing. The aircraft, now a powerless glider, silently cut through the sky, descending towards the Atlantic Ocean in the dead of night. With no engines to control thrust or reverse power for slowing down, the pilots had to rely solely on their skill and the plane's natural aerodynamics. The crew had already completed the emergency procedure for when all engines fail, and now, with nothing but hope and the craft's remaining glide power, they set their sights on Liège Airport. In the pitch black, finding the runway was no easy task. The tower controller, fully aware of their dire situation, began flickering the runway lights on and off, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The captain, fighting fatigue and overwhelming stress, managed to keep the aircraft aloft, balancing between the ideal glide speed and the stall warning speed, a delicate dance that would determine their fate. As they neared runway 33, the captain realized their descent strategy had worked a little too well. Instead of being at the ideal 3,000 feet for approach, the aircraft was at a dizzying 13,000 feet, but dangerously close to the runway. Without the luxury of engines to make quick altitude adjustments, the crew faced a new problem. They were much too high for a safe landing. Desperate to lose altitude, the captain made a snap decision. A 360 degrees turn, a classic glider maneuver that would allow them to shed around 4,000 to 5,000 feet. As the aircraft banked, the first officer took swift action, lowering the landing gear and repositioning the wings, crucial steps to maximize lift and avoid dangerous drag. The second stretched on as the plane completed the turn, slowly leveling its wings and preparing for the final descent. But as the runway loomed ahead, the pilots were still caught in a precarious position. They were too high for a standard landing approach, yet too low to attempt another full turn to lose more altitude. Time was running out, and the crew knew that this was their one and only chance to bring the plane down safely. With both engines silent, there was no room for error. The pilots had one shot at landing the powerless Airbus A330 on the narrow runway at Lajes Airport. The first officer kept a vigilant eye on the airspeed as the plane approached its final descent. But this landing was far from ordinary. Without the use of flaps, the aircraft was descending at an unnervingly high speed, almost 200 knots, far faster than the usual 145 knots. The tension in the cockpit was palpable as the captain relied on the first officer to guide him through this high-speed, engineless landing. When the massive jet struck the runway, it was with a force that sent shockwaves through the fuselage. 8 of the plane's 12 tires burst from the impact, causing the plane to bounce back into the air, touching down again over 3,000 feet from the start of the runway. Now, the race was on to bring the speeding aircraft to a halt, but with no functioning wing spoilers and no reverse thrust from the engines, slowing down the plane became a monumental challenge. To make matters worse, the anti-skid system, designed to prevent the wheels from locking up, malfunctioned. As the captain applied the brakes, the tires screeched and skidded, dragging the jet dangerously close to the end of the runway. At last, the plane came to a stop, just 600 feet short of disaster. But even then, the danger wasn't over. Fires had broken out in the left main gear, threatening to turn this miraculous landing into a catastrophe. Wasting no time, Captain Piche ordered an emergency evacuation. Incredibly, all passengers and crew were safely off the aircraft in under 90 seconds, escaping the fire and chaos unharmed. As the sun rose over Lajes, news of the incident spread quickly. The crew was hailed as heroes for executing the longest glide of a passenger aircraft in aviation history. Yet, in the days that followed, questions began to arise. What exactly had led to the critical fuel shortage over the Atlantic? Had the crew missed key warning signs? The praise that once showered over them began to turn into scrutiny as investigators dug deeper into the series of events that almost ended in tragedy. As the dust settled on the Air Transat Flight 236 incident, investigators and aviation experts closely analyzed the decisions made by the crew. One glaring question loomed over their actions. Why had the pilots seemingly ignored the repeated warnings about the rapidly depleting fuel? This oversight, coupled with cognitive bias, led to a series of missteps that almost ended in catastrophe. In the aftermath, this incident served as a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. Significant changes were introduced in aviation safety procedures, with a strong emphasis on the management of fuel leaks and the correct interpretation of non-normal checklists. Airbus, in particular, implemented a critical upgrade to their flight management systems, a new warning system that would alert pilots of significant fuel loss, a vital early warning of a potential fuel leak. While the pilots' oversight could not be ignored, the final report acknowledged that they were unaware of the fuel leak, but commended them for their exceptional handling of the aircraft after both engines failed. Despite the perilous situation, Captain Robert Pitch skillfully guided the powerless plane to a safe landing, with crucial support from First Officer Dirk de Jager. Their quick thinking and exceptional airmanship earned them the Airline Pilots Association's Superior Airmanship Award, a testament to their extraordinary efforts. 3 key factors emerged as the primary causes of the incident. Firstly, the fuel leak stemmed from the incorrect installation of a spare engine. Secondly, the crew's training had not adequately prepared them for fuel leak scenarios, leading them to focus on balancing fuel rather than suspecting a leak. Finally, cognitive bias played a significant role. The crew's assumptions clouded their ability to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. As we reflect on this dramatic tale, it reminds us of the critical importance of thorough training, meticulous equipment checks, and the need to always be prepared for the unexpected. The story of Air Transat Flight 236 is one of survival, extraordinary skill, and hard-earned lessons. If this video resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who appreciate gripping tales of aviation history. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Thank you for watching.